Opening the door for queenside development, this knight leap aims to gain central influence and control key squares without immediately committing pawns. Asserting central space immediately, this pawn advance establishes a solid foothold and begins the fight for initiative on the d-file. Establishing central dominion, this thrust prepares for further pawn advances and controls key squares. Developing knights early often helps control central squares and prepares for castling. Challenging the center's grip and seizing initiative on the queen side, this advance forces black into immediate decisions about pawn structure and piece harmony. Solidifying the center, e6 prepares to develop the bishop and reinforces the d5 pawn, setting the stage for a classical pawn structure. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, increasing central pressure and preparing for pawn advances or further piece activity. Developing the bishop here prepares castling and challenges white's aggressive pawn structure, aiming for a solid central foothold. Positioning the queen centrally prepares for an eventual queenside expansion, while also safeguarding the kingside castling rights for later. Probing white's bishop placement reveals a potential weakness, though it opens the kingside to future pressure. Trading the bishop for the knight here immediately simplifies the position, removing a key defender from black's kingside structure and creating doubled pawns for them. This exchange prepares for potential pawn advances and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming for a more fluid game with increased attacking chances. Accepting the bishop trade solidifies black's pawn structure on the kingside, though it does grant white a temporary bishop pair and slightly more central pawn presence. This opens a clear diagonal for white's queen towards the kingside, a positional element to monitor closely. Solidifying the center with a pawn advance, white aims to build a stable pawn structure and prepare for kingside castling. This quietly develops the pawn's influence, potentially restricting black's central play and opening lines for the rook should it find its way to the e-file. Securing the monarch by tucking it away allows black to focus on developing pieces and contesting central control, a sound strategic decision after the exchanged bishop. Intending to gain space on the kingside and potentially open lines against the castled king, white boldly advances the h-pawn, creating an immediate structural commitment. This aggressive pawn thrust, while aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup, also subtly weakens white's own king's pawn shield, demanding careful subsequent prophylaxis. Creating a pawn barrier on the kingside, black prepares to challenge white's central ambitions, though this pawn push somewhat weakens the dark squares around the king. Establishing a formidable cavalry presence in the center, this knight's deployment aims to solidify white's pawn structure and prepare for potential central advances or queenside expansion, while also keeping a watchful eye on black's kingside. Solidifying the queenside structure and preparing for potential queenside expansion, black reinforces their central pawn chain and seeks to contest the d4 square more effectively. This move, while seemingly passive, contributes to a harmonious pawn formation, restricting white's immediate knight maneuvers and setting the stage for a balanced middle-game struggle where queenside play might become a key battleground. Securing the king in the heart of potential conflict becomes the priority, while simultaneously opening a path for the rook to join the fray along the now less obstructed queen's file. Developing the knight towards the center aims to reinforce black's pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks in the d-file, while simultaneously freeing the e8 square for the rook. The king's embarkment to b1 offers a strategic sanctuary, simultaneously freeing the c1 square for a rook and sidestepping any immediate tactical threats that might arise along the b-file. Repositioning the bishop to this diagonal after the knight exchange subtly reinforces the queenside structure, while also creating potential attacking angles towards white's castled king should the center open up. Initiating a repositioning of the bishop to a more active diagonal, this development prepares to exert pressure along the dark squares and potentially support a kingside advance later on, while also safeguarding against any immediate threats to the queen. Developing the queenside presence with a pawn maneuver can be a sensible step, aiming to prepare for future expansion or to restrict white's pieces, though it does commit a pawn and might slightly weaken the queenside pawn structure if not supported adequately. Opening the c-file now invites potential pressure, immediately challenging black's central pawn structure and creating a direct line of communication for white's rooks. Opening the c-file for the rook creates an immediate dynamic presence, challenging white's central pawn structure and opening a crucial pathway for future operations along that contested file, forcing a strategic reevaluation of white's king safety as well as pawn chain integrity. Initiating a central pawn thrust now, white aims to shatter black's pawn chain and seize the initiative, potentially opening lines towards the king while creating dynamic tension. Embracing central dynamism, the pawn thrust bravely challenges white's imposing central presence, initiating a fascinating pawn exchange and opening the d-file for potential piece activity. Reclaiming that central square with the bishop immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens a diagonal for potential kingside pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around the black monarch which, though castled, isn't entirely out of danger. Unleashing a queenside pressure, this move immediately targets white's pawn structure and eyes the weak b2 square, forcing a response and potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed kingside castling shelter. Embracing aggression, white initiates a kingside pawn storm with g4, aiming to pry open lines for his pieces and generate immediate attacking chances against black's somewhat exposed king, creating a direct confrontation of pawn structures. Embracing the open c-file, black marshals their rook, preparing for potential incursions and reinforcing the queenside, while implicitly challenging white's aggressive pawn advance. Injecting a knight into the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses, all while eyeing the unprotected a6 pawn. Black's queen retreats, but its positioning on the queenside now feels somewhat exposed, potentially becoming a target for white's upcoming maneuvers. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust, white ignites the kingside battle, aiming to pry open lines and expose black's monarch with a dangerous pawn storm. Solidifying the pawn chain with h5 might seem like a natural defensive reaction, but it creates an isolated pawn on g6, a long-term structural weakness that white will undoubtedly try to exploit by initiating an attack on that square, potentially leading to a king's side assault and sacrificing material for open lines. The knight's journey to c5 opens up a fascinating array of positional possibilities, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. This repositioning is a calculated risk, as it temporarily vacates the d3 square for the bishop and allows black's queen to potentially eye the now unguarded c4 square, although it's currently well defended. The knight's presence on c5 puts pressure on the b7 pawn and aims to create weaknesses in black's pawn chain, potentially leading to a more favorable pawn majority for white in the center or queenside later on. It's a move that breathes new life into white's initiative, forcing black to carefully consider their defensive setup and consider how to neutralize this active piece. The tension it creates could easily escalate into a tactical skirmish if black miscalculates their response. Embracing the queenside initiative, the rook slides to b8, a measured step to challenge white's pawn structure and perhaps prepare for future pawn advances or file occupation. A bold maneuver, this knight's advance, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain influence over the central squares, particularly d7 and f7, while simultaneously probing for weaknesses that might arise from the advanced g-pawn. Finally, black liberates their knight, activating a piece that had been somewhat passive. This maneuver aims to contest the central squares and disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for counterplay. This maneuver reclaims central square influence and aims to restrict black's queenside mobility by forcing a decision on the bishop's positioning, potentially creating weaknesses on the dark squares as the knight repositions for a more active role. Seizing the initiative along the queenside with an unexpected queen repositioning, 21. QB4 immediately challenges white's rook on a1 and forces a defensive posture, while simultaneously preparing to exploit the open queenside files should white commit to further pawn advances or leave weaknesses behind. Unlocking the d-file opens up immediate possibilities, potentially creating a passed pawn later or exerting pressure on black's queen. The doubled c-pawns now become a target, But more importantly, white has finally committed to a more aggressive central plan after a period of maneuvering. Reclaiming initiative by developing the bishop to its active diagonal. This maneuver aims to pressure white's queen and potentially disrupt its coordination. Seizing the initiative with a knight's bold advance, this move aims to disrupt black's delicate pawn structure and potentially isolate the queen. It creates immediate discomfort, forcing a reaction as the knight eyes squares like c8 and e8, threatening to become a significant nuisance. Consider the long-term implications of this pressure. It might pave the way for other pieces to enter the fray more effectively. Black, by bringing the bishop to a4, is bravely challenging white's centralized knight and indirectly pressuring the d6 pawn. This maneuver creates a fascinating positional duel, with black aiming to unravel their pieces and potentially disrupt white's queenside development. Consider the long-term implications of this bishop's activity. It could become a powerful attacking piece or a crucial defender depending on how the position evolves. The tension created here is palpable, forcing white to carefully consider their next steps to maintain their structural integrity. Preparing to consolidate the central foothold by reinforcing the e4 pawn, this move aims to restrict black's queen and bishop activity, while also creating a more resilient pawn structure for white's own king. A bold attempt to seize initiative by challenging the advanced pawn, though it opens lines for white's knights and potentially weakens the queenside structure if white can exploit it. Seizing the open diagonal with the queen aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and threaten the vulnerable b7 square. Embracing the pawn structure change, black seizes the open c-file, a crucial artery for piece penetration, while simultaneously removing white's central pawn presence and freeing the a5 square for potential knight maneuvering or bishop repositioning. Opening the queenside immediately simplifies the position, and by trading off the queens, white gains an advantage in initiative as black's king remains somewhat exposed in the center of the board. Re-establishing the rook on an open file after a tactical exchange opens up a clear path for it to become an active participant in the game, potentially targeting weak pawns or supporting a future pawn push. Solidifying the pawn chain, white aims to prevent black's rook from infiltrating the kingside while preparing to advance the kingside pawns, potentially opening lines towards the black king. The bishop's retreat to d4 strategically repositions a key defender, reinforcing the pawn chain's stability and subtly preparing to contest the c-file should it open, while simultaneously offering a potential escape route should the queenside become overly congested. Seizing the initiative with a daring knight sortie to the 7th rank, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create immediate tactical headaches. This aggressive placement, while seemingly exposed, forces black to constantly be aware of potential forks and skewers, limiting their piece mobility and dictating their defensive responses. The knight's advanced position acts as a constant thorn, threatening to pry open lines or exploit weaknesses that might arise from black's hurried attempts to dislodge it. Suddenly, black's rook finds a vital outpost on the open c-file, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially target the pawn weaknesses that have emerged. Securing the king's position becomes paramount as the queens have been exchanged, shifting the game into a strategic middle game where pawn weaknesses and piece activity will determine the victor. Strategically, repositioning the bishop to d7 aims to consolidate the queenside defenses and prepare for a potential regrouping maneuver, perhaps eyeing the now exposed c4 pawn. It's a patient move, prioritizing structural integrity over immediate confrontation, allowing white's knight on b7 to potentially become a target. The knight's detour to a5 is a curious regrouping, aiming to unsettle black's rook on c8 by threatening to probe the queenside. This maneuver sacrifices immediate central influence for potential future disruption, seeking to exploit any awkwardness in black's pawn structure. The aggressive kingside pawn push from white seems to have stalled, and this knight repositioning suggests a shift in strategy, perhaps eyeing a queenside invasion or preparing to support a pawn break. It's a subtle repositioning, trading immediate attacking energy for a more flexible, albeit less direct, approach to gaining an advantage. The rook now finds a remarkably active outpost on the 5th rank, threatening to infiltrate the queenside and disrupt white's structure. repositioning the knight to a more active central square, aiming to exert pressure and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure or initiate new attacking ideas. Reclaiming the b-file immediately establishes black's presence on a key open corridor, challenging white's knight and preparing for a potential pawn push or further piece repositioning. Repositioning the rook to d3 actively combats the encroaching black rook on the b-file, aiming to create opportunities for counterplay by contesting control of central files and preventing black from consolidating their pieces. The king ventures into the fray, a bold maneuver seeking to activate a slumbering monarch amidst a complex pawn structure and potential tactical skirmishes. The knight's repositioning to d6 intensifies pressure on the queenside pawns and prepares for potential incursions into black's territory, aiming to exploit the weakened b6 square and potentially fork the rook and pawn. The rook's journey to the 5th rank aims to consolidate black's position, offering a safe haven for the piece while preparing to contest the critical d-file if the opportunity arises, though its current placement limits its immediate offensive potential on the queen side. Retreating the knight to c4 opens up the d-file for your rook, aiming to contest control over this critical avenue and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure with a timely rd3d8. Repositioning the rook to b5 allows it to potentially support an advance on the queen side or reroute towards the king side if the opportunity arises, while also maintaining a defensive posture against white's knights. Reasserting central presence after a period of tactical skirmishes, this knight's repositioning probes for weaknesses, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially create attacking opportunities on the king side or exploit open lines. Recapturing the pawn and re-establishing a doubled pawn structure on the c-file might seem like the obvious path, but your choice here to swing the rook back to the queen side, aiming for the b4 square, demonstrates a keen positional awareness. You're acknowledging that white's knight on c4 is currently a powerful piece, and by forcing a potential exchange, or at least creating a dynamic challenge for it, you're preventing it from becoming a dominant force in the center or on the king side. This move subtly shifts the focus from immediate material considerations to the underlying positional struggle, aiming to untangle your pieces and prepare for a more active defense or counterplay on the flank. Attempting to dislodge black's robust knight outpost, this pawn thrust might also inadvertently create a weakness on the b3 square if black can reposition their rook effectively. Rescuing the rook from its vulnerable outpost on b6 aims to regroup, but it surrenders the initiative and leaves white with a decided material advantage that promises a straightforward path to victory. A tactical reshuffle, aiming to provoke an immediate concession or create a new weakness in black's otherwise solid structure. Reassessing the board from this position, black's immediate concern is the precarious placement of the knight on b7, currently held in check by the rook on d3 and the king on c2. By shifting the rook from b5 to b4, black aims to solidify its defenses and prepare for a potential regrouping of forces. This maneuver seeks to maintain a solid pawn structure on the queen side and potentially open up lines for future counterplay, while simultaneously avoiding the immediate tactical threats posed by white's active pieces. The knight's zigzagging journey across the board culminates in a surprising return to d6, hinting at potential harassment of the c8 rook, or perhaps a veiled threat on f7 if black isn't careful. The rook's retreat on b6 allows for a potential regrouping, but it concedes valuable central space and neglects the open files, leaving the remaining pawns somewhat exposed to future pressure. Re-establishing the knight on its active central square signals a shift in white's strategy, aiming to exploit the slightly passive placement of black's pieces and potentially generate new attacking chances by consolidating forces before committing to further pawn advances or piece exchanges. Activating the bishop towards the open queenside files introduces a new dimension, aiming to disrupt white's established pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses in the long run. Liberating the knight from its cramped outpost on c4 suddenly creates a very concrete threat against black's vulnerable bishop on b5. Finally, a necessary exchange to simplify matters and address the imposing knight on d6. This capture is more than just removing an annoying piece. It's a crucial step in the transition towards an endgame where the opponent's material advantage might become more pronounced if not dealt with decisively. The bishop's presence on a4 was making white's queenside quite uncomfortable, and forcing this trade, even at the cost of the bishop's attacking potential on the long diagonal, is a pragmatic decision. The immediate aftermath will likely see white recapture, continuing the battle in a somewhat less complex position, but the pressure remains on black to find a way to utilize the material advantage. Reclaiming the king from the immediate threat of the bishop, white's monarch now ventures into the open, a bold choice that will undoubtedly test its defensive capabilities in the unfolding endgame. Capturing the rook with the king on d3, having just lost a piece, signals a desperate attempt to salvage some material from a clearly disadvantageous position. Black's king now finds itself in the thick of the action, a risky endeavor that could lead to immediate tactical opportunities for white if not handled with extreme care. The king steps out of shadow, venturing towards the contested central squares, a bold gambit for activity in this increasingly open board. Black is finally getting some activity for the bishop, aiming to exploit the potential outpost on d6 and perhaps challenge white's weakened pawn structure. Unlocking the king's path offers white the initiative, aiming to activate the rook and challenge black's isolated queen's knight pawn. This king's desperate dash to the center aims to activate its dormant presence, seeking to influence the crucial central squares and potentially support an endgame where it might prove more valuable than its current static position. Seeking to centralize the rook and challenge black's bishop from a more active square. Unblocking the bishop to engage on the queenside opens up possibilities for counterplay against white's slightly passive rook setup, potentially activating the c8 square. Asserting control over the open files begins now. Black's bishop relocates, aiming to disrupt white's coordination by offering a tempo to reposition and potentially contest the critical c-file, a maneuver designed to exploit the somewhat passive placement of white's remaining rook. Repositioning the rook to the second rank creates immediate pressure on the f7 pawn and offers a potential escape square should black's bishop advance further down the diagonal. Unpinning the bishop and initiating a pawn race by bringing the rook back into play presents a dynamic shift, aiming to complicate the position and potentially exploit white's slightly awkward piece placement on the queenside. Reactivating the bishop's diagonal offers white a potential pathway to infiltrate black's queenside pawn structure, should the opportunity arise. The bishop's retreat to the c1 square after a long journey across the board signals a passive defense and potentially a missed opportunity for active counterplay. Unlocking the file creates an immediate threat of penetration, forcing black to dedicate resources to defense and potentially disrupting their already awkward piece placement. Reactivating the bishop to a3 offers a glimpse of potential counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and perhaps find a way to outmaneuver the rook on the 7th rank. Unlocking the b4 square for your bishop provides an immediate active presence, creating pressure along the open files and potentially forcing concessions from black's rook. Exploring the open file provides a fresh avenue of counterplay, challenging white's pawn structure and potentially forcing concessions. The king cautiously ventures out, seeking safety behind a potential pawn shield, but this positioning invites further counterplay on the weakened queenside. The bishop zigzags across the board, a delightful pinball of positional pressure, threatening to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain. The king's journey to safety is paramount, and relocating it from this exposed square, where it's currently a target for the rook and bishop battery, is the immediate priority. Challenging the encroaching rook and preparing to blockade the d-file, a critical defensive maneuver to prevent further infiltration. Reoccupying the central file offers a chance to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for the rook, though it repositions the piece rather passively for the moment. Opening up the file offers a chance to potentially activate the rook, but it also signals the white king's increasing exposure as the board simplifies. The king bravely ventures back into the fray, aiming to shore up the central pawn structure and prepare for the inevitable endgame. Securing the king's well-being becomes paramount as the endgame looms, preventing any immediate skewers or discoveries that could unravel the delicate balance. This maneuver aims to regroup the white king, potentially seeking better safety on the queenside or preparing to support a central pawn advance if an opportunity arises. Securing the monarch's central presence aims to leverage its newfound activity for potential pawn advances, a sharp contrast to the passive maneuvering seen earlier. King's repositioning begins its perilous journey to safety, seeking solace on the queenside as the rook's eye potential infiltration routes. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure with this advance forces white to confront the potential for a passed c-pawn, potentially creating significant strategic complications for the white king in the coming stages. Opening the queenside pawn structure offers a tempo gain on black's passed c-pawn, but grants black's bishop newfound activity along the open diagonal. Now that white's pieces are awkwardly placed, seizing the open file offers a potent way to disrupt their coordination and create immediate threats against the isolated king. The king ventures into the heart of the storm, a daring gamble to disrupt black's advancing pawn chain by offering a queen exchange. A forced sequence unfolds, bringing white's monarch into the open as the rook cleaves through the weakened defense, targeting the vulnerable king. The king abandons the d-file's relative safety, stepping into the crossfire of the rook and bishop, a decision that opens up immediate tactical possibilities for black to exploit the open lines. The black king, now exposed by the kingside pawn push, finds itself the target of a potential mating net, forcing careful maneuvering to avoid immediate disaster.